I am Courtney Kohler. I am the Senior Associate at the Community Action Partnership, and I'll be taking you through this webinar today and talking about these standards, answering any questions you might have. So our agenda today, we're going to be doing an overview of the partnership's tools and resources, first and foremost, just to let you know where all those things are at. And then we're going to be reviewing standards 7.1 through 7.9, and we're going to be looking at the interpretation and documentation, having a little bit of question and answer over each standard, and then look at some different promising practices and resources. A lot of what we'll be doing today focuses on some best practices that Whipley has shared with the network, and so we'll be further distributing those through this presentation today. We're also going to see if there's any requests out there for additional training and technical assistance resources. So as we're going through this webinar today, please be thinking about if there's anything you might need in the way of resources, and let us know that at the end. And then we'll do a few announcements about upcoming events as we close out today. So this will be about a 60-minute webinar, and right now everybody is muted on the event end of things, but what we'll do is you can use the chat or the Q&A box to send in your questions, and we'll field those after each standard that we go through. All right, so today, as we look at these organizational standards, as many of you know, these are categorized into 3 thematic groups. And so the first thematic group is maximum feasible participation. The second is vision and direction, and then the third is operations and accountability. And so we're over here in this third tier today, and we're looking at human resource management, which is that 7th standard. So just a little side note, there's some standards of excellence that are different from the organizational standards. So the kind of framework for achieving excellence in community action is rooted in these community action standards of excellence. And so not to confuse these with the organizational standards, but there's 35 of these standards that represent the very best practices of the very best agencies in community action. And they represent real-world administrative and operational benchmarks that every agency can strive for. So this is the Pathways to Excellence program, is when agencies go through this process and look at these standards in their agency. And these are kind of above and beyond the organizational standards. The organizational standards looks at the minimum requirements that are required for all community action agencies. And then these are kind of the step above. So just to kind of let you know, as your agency is looking at organizational standards and how to meet and exceed those, these standards of excellence are kind of that next step. So as people are interested in that, you can always reach out to the partnership for more information. So to let you know where a lot of our resources are at, because we have lots and lots of resources around organizational standards, on the new partnership website, which is still the same address, communityactionpartnership.com, you can go to the Tools and Resources menu tab, and there'll be an area for publications, for a video library, so you can find all of the partnership's training technical assistance resources housed on this site. Specifically to note, we have training and technical assistance guides, toolkits, and webinars for each of the 9 categories. So each category includes some information on additional guidance, so looking at the definition of the standard, what compliance is required, and then the documentation. And then it goes into beyond compliance, looks at different resources that you can use, and then there's different assessment scales as well. And so this is just kind of a picture of the different toolkit sections, and that's on each of the 9 standards. And then this is a picture here of the assessment scales. So these are for internal use by the agencies, and they help you move from meeting that minimum requirement to going beyond compliance. And then as well, there are those accompanying webinars that are used to kind of supplement these toolkits and assessment scales. Then we also have our CSBG TNTA Resource Center, and so that's csbgtta.org. And on this site, you can create an account and look at many of our different resources. We have over 900 resources on this website. There's also consultant bank with over 150 consultants that have been screened as they've entered their information into this resource bank. There's also a training calendar as well as a discussion forum. So there's questions you have for your peers. You can enter them in there. And then also a shared calendar. So lots of different resources and tools on this website, and I encourage you to check it out. There is also the capability that you don't necessarily have to create an account. You can still just get in and search for resources if you'd like to do that. So the overview of the TA guide structure, basically the purpose is to assist with the definition, the intent, and the documentation of the standards. Section A of the TA guide covers the definition and intent. Section B covers the interpretation and the documentation. And then it also provides resources for kind of the go-to for beyond compliance. And Section C provides some of the best practices and diagnostic questions, and then Section D provides those resources that you can access. So as we're getting into section or category 7 and looking at the 9 standards within this category, Wipfli has been split up in some of their resources into 3 different categories. So we kind of feel like that's somewhat helpful to be able to break down, you know, in these in some of different categories. So looking at HR policies and procedures, 7.1, 7.2, 7.7 all relate to that. 7.4 and 7.5 relate to effective HR governance. And then 7.3, 6, 8, and 9 all relate to effective HR management. All right. So before we get started, I'm just going to check in, see if there's any questions or anything like that to address. At this time, I don't think I see any before we get started, so that is good. All right, so looking at standards related to HR policies and procedures. With the first one, we're going to go through these, so you're going to see that they're a little bit kind of out of order throughout the presentation, but that's because we're going through them in their respective categories. And so all of these first 3 standards are looking at the HR policies and procedures. So standard 7.1, the organization has written personnel policies that have been reviewed by an attorney and approved by the governing board within the last 5 years. And so this one is looking at the fact that an attorney has to review these policies and procedures. So really the definition and intent of this standard, the personnel policies are also known as the employee handbook, so that's the same thing. You might be calling them different things in your agency. Then the personnel policies are those policies and procedures that apply to all staff, and then they're written and edited in a straightforward layout. The policies need to be comprehensive to cover changing and diverse HR law and regulations. And so looking at things like the Department of Labor, the Office of Management and Budget, any state regulations that your state might have, as well as the Society for Human Resource Management. And so being able to look at those different departments or offices and make sure that all of yours are falling in compliance with those regulations. And then a little bit more on the definition and intent. So this really seeks to ensure uniformity of when and how personnel policies are reviewed, updated, and approved in the agencies. So this sets that maximum time frame to 5 years to making sure that these are examined and in kind of legal compliance at least every 5 years. And then the personnel policies are really that foundation of a strong HR management, and they reflect the values and expectations of the agency and the community action network. So that's kind of why it's important and what the intent of that is. So a little bit of guidance on the documentation. You know, the physical or electronic copy of the personnel policies is a piece of documentation that works. There's no specific list of policies that are required within that. So it really is up to your agency on, what policies are included and how you format that. And then, any in-process policies or procedures, any updates that are coming up, including those drafts in there as well. And then as far as the approval piece of it and the attorney review, board minutes are a piece of documentation that are needed, as well as board resolutions. And then also that statement or invoice from the reviewing attorney. And so being able to provide that evidence that the attorney has reviewed them within the last 5 years, so that evidence would need to be dated as well, since this is a time-sensitive standard. And then that piece of documentation with the board saying that those have been looked at by the board and that the board was involved in that process as well. All right, so before we go to standard 7.2, I'm going to take a look and see if there's any questions here. Okay, there's a question about whether all agencies are required to have an attorney review and whether there's any exceptions to that. And I would say that no, there's no exceptions to that. Looking at whether your agency is a nonprofit or a public agency, with this standard, public agencies is not applicable. So that would be the only exception. But if you are a private nonprofit community action agency, there are no exceptions to this that I am aware of, but I can double check on that just to make sure. Okay. All right, well, I think that's all the questions for now. All right, so we'll go ahead and move on to standard 7.2. And so just to note to you all, the NP stands for nonprofits and the P stands for public. And so trying to split those out because there are some small differences within this category based on whether your agency is a private nonprofit community action agency or a public government entity. So standard 7.2 on the nonprofit side, the organization makes available the employee handbook or personnel policies in cases without a handbook to all staff and notifies the staff of any changes. And then the public agency, it's that the department follows the local government policies in making available the employee handbook or personnel policies in cases without a handbook to all staff in notifying staff of any changes. And so a lot of these with the public agency, it's just all about what the local government says. So some of the standards are the same for both nonprofit and public agencies, but with some of these, it's just the fact that we just have to go back to what the local government says is kind of that standard there, and that's what stands for public agencies. So the definition and intent, and so, kind of a question here is what qualifies as makes available. So, really this varies from state to state. It could be posted online or it could be provided directly to staff. But basically there has to be some sort of documentation that shows that it is made available to staff and to all staff in the agency. And so then the other question is what qualifies as notify staff of any changes. And again, this varies state by state, but this is any time that there's an edit made to the personnel policies and looking at what is the process on how you let staff know that there's been a change that's been made and there's a new edition of the employee handbook or personnel policies, whether it be an email with the attachment, that could serve as documentation, whether there's some kind of a sign-off sheet or acknowledgement signature that's made. But every employee needs to have it upon hire, and then staff need to be notified anytime that there is a change, and then that new version has to be made available as well. So that communication would need to communicate specific changes that have been made, so that it's not kind of a hunt for staff to be able to find it, but kind of letting people know which policies changes have been made to. Of course, you wouldn't have to go into great detail, but just even listing out where the changes are. So guidance on documentation for this standard, there needs to be a physical or electronic copy of the personnel policies that the reviewer could look at, so the state CSBG office could look at. The process or procedure document for staff communication, so this might be included within the handbook or policies. You know, whenever the standard documentation is submitted, it could be a memo, an email, you know, things like that, that some of this documentation is included in as far as whenever that staff communication goes out. Then there needs to be documentation of the location and availability of the personnel policies. So, you know, whether it's posted to an online SharePoint access type site, or, you know, where that's located in the office and where staff can find that, and then that has to be written down somewhere, basically. And then there has to be examples of agency communication of policy change notifications to staff. So like I said earlier, that could be anything from an email to a memo that goes out to all staff that needs to show when the changes were made and what changes were made, and that it was distributed to all staff. All right. Well, now we'll pause again for questions just to make sure. So any questions on standard 7.2? I'm going to type them in now. Okay, so I did get a question in. It looks like it was about standard 7.1, which is totally fine. And it's about, is it permissible for the attorney to also be on the board of directors? And I believe this is absolutely permissible. I know that I've heard a lot of agencies that are recruiting attorneys to be able to serve this function on their board. I will double check on that just to make sure. So you might follow up with me via email so I can double check with Cap Law on that. But I'm pretty sure that that is fine, because I know that a lot of board of directors have attorneys on them, and then they can serve a great function in that way. Okay, just scanning for other questions. Okay, I think that addresses everything that's been sent in to this point. All right, so standard 7.7, so like I said, we're going to be kind of jumping around this category. But this is the last one that focuses on HR policies and procedures. The nonprofit standard is that the organization has a whistleblower policy that has been approved by the governing board. And then the public standard is that the department provides a copy of any existing local government whistleblower policy to members of the tripartite board or advisory body at the time of their orientation. And so with this one, just to kind of let you guys know that Cap Law does have some good examples of whistleblower policies. So if you are looking for examples, I encourage you to check out their website, caplaw.org. But really the definition and intent of the standard, it encourages individuals to come forward with credible information on legal practices or violations of adopted policies. So it specifies the organization will protect individuals from retaliation. And then it identifies the staff, board members, or outside parties for reporting. So kind of the purpose behind this is that the Sarbanes-Oxley was an act in 2002 that was passed by Congress to protect investors from the possibility of fraudulent accounting services. or activities by corporations. So it mandated reforms to improve disclosures from corporations and prevent that kind of fraud. And so that's kind of some of the reasoning behind why we have some of these whistleblower policy in place. And then 7.7, the guidance on documentation. There needs to be a physical or electronic copy of the whistleblower policy that is out there for the agency. And so that might be included in your policies and procedures, but this is a specific policy that needs to be included, even though, you know, there's no full list of what has to be included in your policies and procedures. This is one that has to be within your agency. Then there needs to be board minutes that say that the board has taken a look at this policy, as well as any board resolutions for accepting and approving this policy for the agency. All right, so we'll pause again just to see if there's any questions on 7.7. So looking at that whistleblower policy, and just give you guys a couple minutes to enter any of those in. All right, I don't think we have any on this one, so we'll go ahead and move on to our next standard, which these standards, the next two we're going to look at, are related to effective HR governance. So standard 7.4 is that the governing body conducts a performance appraisal of the CEO or executive director within each calendar year. And then for public agencies, the standard just looks at that the department follows the local government procedures for performance appraisal of the department head. So for public agencies, you wouldn't have to adopt a whole new thing. It's whatever the state, or not state, the local government agency says has to happen for performance appraisal. But for nonprofit agencies, this has to happen every year and is conducted by the board, so it clarifies the expectation of the board to provide HR oversight to its only employees, which is the CEO or executive director. Then the board should ensure moral and professional support to further the organization's goal through this process. It promotes a minimum uniform schedule for the executive evaluation, so making sure that it's done on a yearly basis. It manages the risk of executive power and control, so balancing those responsibilities of the board and the executive director and how they are different. And it also improves quality and efficacy of the network's leadership and talent. And then, you know, this could be accomplished through a committee or by the full board. So an important thing to note with this standard is that a lot of times the executive committee will actually conduct the performance appraisal, and that is completely acceptable, but the full board does have to be involved in kind of approving that the appraisal is kind of valid for the executive director. So, you know, the executive committee can do kind of the legwork and even present it to the CEO or executive director, but the full board does have to see it and approve it. And then, you know, just as said there, the full board should receive and accept the appraisal via a vote. So it does have to be voted on. So the guidance on documentation for the standard, you're looking at board minutes, board resolutions. So looking at when that performance appraisal was brought to the full board is what you'll want in those minutes. The bylaws or policies and procedures that talk about the appraisal process for the executive director. Then also the official board communication to the executive, so talking about the performance appraisal, when it will be conducted, as well as any documentation along with the assessment form that might have been communicated to that executive. And then the blank assessment form. So you would just have to show, this is more about the process or, and the fact that it is done on a yearly basis and that the board is doing it. But the actual evaluation of the executive director does not have to be submitted to the state. So the official communication saying, you know, when they might meet and that sort of thing, and then just a blank assessment form has to be provided to the state to show that there's documents available to do that written evaluation. Okay, so that is 7.4. We'll go ahead and pause again to see if there's any questions from anyone before we move on. Okay, so we do have a question about what documentation works for a public agency. And so just going back to the standard and that the department follows the local government procedures for performance appraisal of the department head. So in this case, you would just submit what the local government procedures are and then evidence of following those. And so if it's about the same as it is for the nonprofit, you would provide the same kind of documentation. But if it is different, then say if it's every 6 months or you know, something like that, or if there is some sort of different process, then you would just provide whatever documentation backs up that process. But I would say if it is very similar to the you know, yearly performance appraisal, then you would just submit the same documentation. One thing with this one is that some agencies overall, we'll talk about this a little bit more with a different standard, but some agencies are moving to, there's kind of a trend in HR about this kind of continuous improvement type thing where there's no written evaluations conducted for staff. And so that, with this later standard, you'll see that that is acceptable to follow those policies for the rest of staff, but especially for nonprofit community action agencies, the private ones, you do still have to follow the written evaluation every year to the executive director. However, if public agencies do have a different government procedure for how the performance appraisal is conducted, they only have to follow that. And if that's different from yearly, then that's fine. All right. There's also another question about, would the board of directors be required to perform an evaluation for an interim executive for the nonprofit? I'll have to check on this one. And so let me note your name real quick. And you might send me an email following this webinar, but I believe that if the interim executive was in place for over a year, then yes, that would be, you would have to follow this. But otherwise, I think if it's less than a year, then you would not have to conduct a performance appraisal. But I will double check on that. So if you would, Mary, shoot me an email after this and I'll follow up with a more definite answer. All right, well, I think that's it. So now to standard 7.5. For the private nonprofit agencies, the governing board reviews and approves the CEO or executive director compensation within every calendar year. And then the public agencies, the compensation of the department head is made available according to the local government procedure. So again, with the public, it's just simply you have to follow your local government procedure and then provide some documentation that you followed that procedure. So you would kind of submit the procedure and then back up documentation for that. And then, so for the public nonprofit, we're looking at kind of what this means is it clarifies expectation of the board to provide HR oversight to the only employee, the CEO or executive director. And it should be independently informed and reviewed. It should be market-based, allowable, and reasonable. The salary or compensation should be. It promotes minimum uniform schedule for executive pay. It manages risks of executive power and control, again. And then also includes the salary fringe, health and dental, expense and travel account, vehicle, et cetera. So it should be comprehensive of the full package. And then this is kind of in conjunction with 7.4 a lot of times, and, with the CEO appraisal and review process. And then as a point of reference, the 990 asks, did the process for determining compensation of the following persons include a review and approval by independent persons, comparability data, and substantiation of the deliberation decision. And then in the 990, it asks you to describe the process. So it's kind of going along with what is already being done through that 990 process, that it has to be backed up by market research, allowable and reasonable, that sort of thing. It has to be reviewed on that yearly basis. So with some guidance on documentation that would be submitted for this, board minutes and board resolutions that pertain to when that was brought to the full board and approved. Again, the executive committee might or the fiscal committee might actually do more of the legwork in doing this review process, but the full board does have to see and approve it. Then the bylaws or policies and procedures around this, so it has to be included in the bylaws about this review for the compensation for the executive director. The wage comparability study would need to be submitted as well. So, whatever salary study was done to ensure that it's allowable and reasonable to pay the executive that amount based on where you live, the types of duties, that sort of thing. Usually that's just a page or two of that. And then the raw market data for compensation comparison, which is similar to that above bullet. The official board communication to the executive, so whatever was submitted to the executive saying, the process or that it was being conducted, this review is being conducted. And then the executive employment contract, if that's applicable. So if there's not a contract in place, you wouldn't have to submit one of those. So a contract does not have to be in place, but if there is one, you would want to provide that as documentation. Okay, so we have a question about, can you expand upon independently informed and reviewed? So this would mean that it would need to be informed and reviewed kind of by, you'll have to use kind of the wage comparability study, that raw market data, and so it has to be informed by an outside source that is reliable. So it can't necessarily just be a couple of people in the agency looking at it and saying, I think that this is adequate. So it has to kind of be based on something, is basically what that means. All right, scanning for any other questions on 7.5. Okay, so asking for differentiation between motion in the minutes and a resolution. So a motion in the minutes would be kind of more of a vote process, and the board resolutions would be kind of any actions that would be kind of carrying forward. So I don't know if that explains it very well, but basically, this does have to be taken to the board, and you can kind of provide either or, whichever one is applicable there. So it would have to be in the board minutes, or if there's a resolution to, create a policy, and that sort of around this or edit the policy around this, then that would have to be included as well. So in the minutes, if there's any kind of voting action, like that the compensation was approved, that would have to be provided. As far as any resolutions, that's most of the time that's all included in the board minutes. Okay, so I think that's all we have for now. So we'll go ahead and go on to the standards related to effective HR management. So this is looking at the 4 standards, standards 3, 6, 8, and 9 within category 7. And so with standard 7.3, the nonprofit or private standard says that the organization has written job descriptions for all positions, which have been updated within the past 5 years. And then the public agency, there has to be written job descriptions for all positions. Updates may be outside the purview of the department. So sometimes within the local public community action agency, that might be a couple steps up as far as who is kind of over updating job descriptions. So if that is the case, that documentation would just have to be provided to say who does the updates and when they are done. So then with the local nonprofit, though, they have to be updated every 5 years and have a written job description for all positions. So this is not all different staff members, but every position within the agency. So if you have 10 family advocates, that job description serves the purpose for those 10 people. So the definition and intent of this standard, it ensures job direction and accountability, so making sure that it's relevant and accurate to what people are actually doing within their job and that their job descriptions back that up. It connects each job to the eligible entity's mission or purpose, so making sure that everything is lining up, from the staff member to the program to the overall mission of the agency. It leads to improved performance over time, so helping people be clear on what the expectations are, what their duties are in their job, and being able to review that on a regular basis is always good. It also reduces the risk for compliance or fraud issues. The job descriptions, again, have to be just for each position, not each staff person. And whenever it says in the standard back here that has to be updated within the past 5 years, whenever we're saying updates, it doesn't necessarily mean that there have to be changes. So it might be reviewed and determined that, yes, this job description is still valid, but if there are updates that need to be made, those need to be made at least every 5 years, and it has to be reviewed every 5 years. So the job descriptions, what would be good to include, and you have to include this somewhere to be able to comply with the standard, is kind of maybe in the footer of the job description is the date of the last review or update. So you just put a footer down there that says, current as of July 2017, or last review conducted July 2017, to let people know when that rolling 5-year cycle is. So these are just some features or best practices of what a job description should include. This is not required by the standard, but this is again kind of a resource from Whippley that says what is good to include in a job description. So you're looking at, of course, job title and the reporting relationship, who the supervisor is, the summary or purpose of that position in a couple of sentences, what the essential duties are, the additional duties to cover, anything, other duties as requested, any supervisory responsibilities that the employee might have, the minimal qualifications as far as education, certifications, that kind of thing, any knowledge, skills, or abilities that are required to do the job, the different working conditions, any, ADA or equal opportunity statements that need to be included, as well as the acknowledgement that the employee has received that and reviewed the job description. It's always good to kind of keep up that accountability between the supervisor and the employee. All right, and then guidance on documentation for 7.3. So looking at the job descriptions, of course, the job description would have to be part of documentation. Within larger agencies, this is kind of difficult, but you would want to, go ahead and submit job descriptions for every position, not every employee that you have in your agency. An organizational chart, so to show how that's all structured within your agency. The date of the last review or the update on the job description. Probably the easiest way to do this is to include that footer in there so you don't have to include a different set of documentation about when that last review or update was conducted. And then as far as the board or committee minutes, you would want to note any documents that have been reviewed or updated. So this would be something in the board or committee minutes that would just say, it's not something that has to be necessarily voted on, but just saying that, job descriptions have been updated and that sort of thing, just to kind of have them in the minutes. That's a possible source of documentation. And then any policy or procedure for updating the job description. So, if that's in your personnel policies on how that is done or how often that is done, you would want to submit that as documentation as well. All right. So any questions on 7.3? Maybe a quick scan here. Okay, let me address any on this current standard and then I'll backtrack to the executive compensation one. Can the approved board minutes be the official communication to the executive? I think if that's, as long as it's clear that it is and that, that was actually, of course the executive should be looking at those, but as long as it's clear that it's in there that, this is serving as that official communication to the executive, then that would be fine. But there has to be some sort of official communication, whether it's within, it doesn't necessarily have to be a separate documentation, if that's what you're asking. So yeah, as long as it's clear and the executive sees it and knows it. Okay, now 7.5, are you saying that a motion is not adequate for approval of the CEO evaluation and compensation? No, I think I said that it has to be, that is adequate, but it does have to be kind of looked at as far as, any kind of wage comparability study, looking at raw market data, that should be included, especially I think for minimum requirements, it's mostly that it just has to be approved by the governing board. But within that, best case scenario you're looking at, it needs to be looked at and, based in, what's allowable and reasonable within the market in your local area and that sort of thing. But minimally, it just has to be approved by the governing board and reviewed. So the review part is where it comes in that it should be based in some market research around salaries. Okay. There's one more question on the executive director's salary. So looking back at this, the executive director's salary does have to be reviewed and approved within every calendar year. So if you're a public community action agent, or private, sorry, if you're a nonprofit private community action agency, this does have to be done every calendar year. So yes, annual basis for the executive. And I mean, it might be the case that you set up the executive director salary when they're hired, and then there's kind of a trajectory moving forward as far as when there's increases and things like that. But it does need to be looked at and at least reviewed and approved by the board every year. So it might not mean you don't necessarily have to change it. You could continue on that same trajectory, but the board does have to review and approve where you're at on that trajectory on an annual basis. And that kind of aligns with the annual appraisal process as well. You can do it all at the same time. Okay. I believe we're ready to move on to the next standard, which we'll be looking at 7.6 now. Sorry for all the flipping back and forth. So the private nonprofit standard is that the organization has a policy in place for regular written evaluation of employees by their supervisors. And so this is the one where I was talking about earlier that there's kind of a trend in place where there's a lot more coaching going on in agencies, which is a great thing. So it's more of an ongoing evaluation process where there's a lot of verbal feedback that's being given on a regular basis. And that's perfectly fine, but there has to be a policy in place saying that that is what the agency is doing. And so this one is really about the policy that's in place and less about the written evaluation. However, with the executive director and CEO, that one is specific to the fact that that written evaluation has to be conducted every year. So with this one, it really is that there just needs to be a policy in place for the regular written evaluation of employees by their supervisor. And if that policy is that, you know, written evaluations are not conducted, but it's more of a verbal review process that's ongoing, then that's fine. It's about the policy that's in place. Then as far as the public agency, the standard is looking at the department following the local government policies for the evaluation process. And so again, as with a lot of public agency standards, it's really looking at what is the policy for the local government agency, and then has it been followed. So again, this is really just about that policy in place and what is it for the public agency. Okay, so the definition and intent of this standard requires that a policy is in place. So that's going to be the main source of documentation that we're going to talk about here in a minute. It doesn't imply that 100% of employees must have an annual review. So it's whatever your agency has decided the review process is. And there's really no, as you can see from the previous slide, there's really no time-sensitive piece on it. Although I would recommend that there is some sort of guidance in there, at least for staff to know when evaluations or how evaluations will be conducted. So they kind of have that timeline in their mind. So that timeline piece does help to ensure accountability and improve performance over time, and as well as just having a policy in place in general. It improves the quality and efficacy of the network talent. And so being able to have that evaluation process for employees to be able to get feedback, to try new things, get the development and training that they need is very important. It identifies an approach to evaluation by all supervisors. And then also it manages risks of claims or lawsuits. So if this regular evaluation process is going on and there's policies in place around that, there's less room for issues to arise as far as you know, employees not knowing that something was wrong and then all of a sudden an action taking place to as a result of that. So it's always good for policies and communication to be in place around the evaluation of an employee. All right, so the guidance on documentation here, it's really all about, like I said, that policy. So there has to be a physical or electronic copy of the evaluation policy, process, or procedure, whatever you want to call it, which is likely going to be found in the personnel policies. So again, this is one of those that while there's not a specific list of policies and procedures, the standards do call out a couple, like the whistleblower policy, the staff evaluation policy, as well as the CEO evaluation process, that kind of thing. So all of those have to be included, either in the bylaws or the policies and procedures, although there's not a definitive list overall. And then you would want to submit whatever blank assessment form or anything associated with the process. And, again, if there's not a written evaluation form that your agency uses because they have a certain policy in place that doesn't require that, then you wouldn't have to submit the blank assessment form. Okay, so we'll pause for questions on 7.6 real quick. All right, not seeing any at this point. We'll go on, but if you have questions, of course, continue to answer those or enter those in. With 7.8, this standard is looking at staff participating in new employee orientation within 60 days of hire. So that's the standard for all private nonprofit community action agencies. For public agencies, it's looking at whether the department follows a local government policy for new employee orientation. So public, you just have to follow your local government policy. For nonprofit community action agencies, the employees have to participate in that orientation within 60 days of their start date. So the definition and intent of this, it really ensures that smooth transition with the hiring process and onboarding and training for all staff into the organization and network. So this should be occurring for every single staff that starts for your agency, whether they're part-time, full-time, whatever it might be. It serves as that first connection of employees to the mission and vision of the organization, so being able to communicate that well during that time. It drives employee productivity and results, so it helps to manage those expectations and make sure those are clear, and really increases that talent retention because people are more likely to achieve better if they're clear on what their expectations are. There's no necessarily curricular requirements on what's included in the orientation, but there's a lot of great resources out there on what to include in an employee orientation process. And it may be met through individual or group orientation, so the process isn't defined either, but they have to be oriented somehow. And the date of hire is the first day that the employee works with the organization. So whenever they step foot in and start getting paid or working or conducting those duties, that is their first day of hire and 60 days within that. So these are some examples of important orientation content. So you really want to ingrain the mission and history of community action first and foremost, looking at time and effort reporting, so being able to fill out timesheets, things like that. So that's kind of on the paperwork side of things. We definitely want to cover ROMA as something that's strongly suggested, because that's always kind of a confusing point for staff a lot of times when they enter an agency. Looking at data collection, any kind of reporting that the staff might have to do and why it's being done, what has to be reported. Obviously, the job description, performance expectations, any additional education or training that needs to be done for the employee to conduct their job at the level they're supposed to, as well as where tools and resources are to help them do their jobs well. And then, of course, any personnel policies and employee handbook within the agency needs to be given at that time as well. Then as far as documentation, the physical or electronic copy of the personnel policies or employee handbook is part of the documentation. Any orientation packet or materials, even a listing of those, as well as documentation of attendance from HR or personnel files. So it might be, if you have a group orientation, you could submit a sign-in sheet showing staff that have gone through that. If it's more of an individual orientation, you can use kind of an acknowledgement form to say that so-and-so participated in this such and such hours orientation, on whatever date, and then the employee and supervisor both sign. All right. So questions on this standard? All right, not seeing any at this point. We'll go ahead and move on because I know we're coming up to the top of the hour. Again, though, if you have questions, please enter them in. Standard 7.9, this looks at the organization conducting or making available staff development and training, including ROMA, on an ongoing basis. And then for a public agency, it's really about the department conducting or making available, again, staff development or training on an ongoing basis. So with both, it's about the same thing. The definition and intent of this, it really, ROMA is not necessarily required, but it's strongly suggested because the network needs to be aligned to results in accountability. And so this really helps for staff to understand ROMA and really getting that training out there on an ongoing basis. Then it also ensures the best use of people potential. So if you're investing in employees with staff development and training, they're going to be able to, have improved quality of their work and really that solidify that efficacy of the network's talent. Then we want to make sure that it's kind of that targeted, efficient use of TNTA funds. So we want to make sure that whatever training plan that's in place is intentional. Of course, there's no requirement on training topics or delivery methods. So, the freedom is kind of up to the agency. But kind of what's recommended, at least from the partnership, is to kind of conduct that training needs assessment of what training is needed for individual staff as well as agency-wide, and really put together an intentional training plan to make sure that you're using, the time and the funds to the best possible use to really develop staff. There's a few resources the partnership has that are kind of those out-of-the-box trainings that you can just pick up and do. One is the Elite Leadership Training. Then there's also the Building Your Leadership Bench toolkit, and then there's one on succession planning as well. So these are all kind of good topics that kind of help that development process with employees. So that you can find those on our website under Tools and Resources, or you can also email me and I can guide you to finding those. So there's different examples of training or development delivery methods. It could be via third party or the agency. So you can go to conferences. Of course, we have our Management and Leadership Conference at the national level every January. Also, our annual convention every August. And so there's also great state association conferences, regional conferences, and even outside the Community Action Network as well. And so any of these can be included and provide documentation for this standard. So guidance on documentation, really looking at training professional development plans. Those are great for staff and to include. So really bringing in the staff to participate in those training and professional development plans as well to kind of get that buy-in and input from them. Any documentation of agency trainings, documentation of attendance at off-site trainings or conferences, as well as any HR personnel files around what training is being conducted and who's had it. All right, and then just as we wrap up today, just those top 3 best practices to go beyond compliance with these HR standards, and then I'll look real quick at any last questions. But kind of with HR policies and procedures, you want to review discipline warnings and compliance documentation over the past 5 years, conduct a brief survey or interviews to evaluate strengths and weaknesses of personnel policies and related communication, and then ensure your attorney is qualified or credentialed as well. With the HR governance standards, you want to align the executive performance appraisal to the agency's strategic vision, looking at executive performance feedback from outside the board, as well as conduct a full wage comparability study for the executive position. So this is what I was talking about with kind of that market-based wage study. And then again, with effective HR management, looking at designing performance management as a process instead of an event, customizing training opportunities to development areas and individual performance evaluations, and then establishing a system of coaching and mentoring versus that system of managing and discipline. So those are kind of those best practices to go beyond compliance. Successful transitions and improvement over the course of the year, and then, throughout a career, kind of have these different features to them. So you can see those in the slides, which we'll be posting after this webinar. So here's contact information. I flew through those last couple of slides, but we're going to be providing the slides as well as the recording of the webinar. So that'll be posted to our website under the organizational standards page. And if you have any questions, please feel free to follow up with me directly or Joel Crocker, our Director of Training and Technical Assistance. I know there's a couple questions on here that I was a little unsure of the answer, so please follow up with me so that I can make sure to get you the confirmed answer on those things. So I'll check real quick for any last questions. Just talked about the recording, so yes, that will be available on our website, on the organizational standards page, and I think that's all I see. So thank you all for joining in this webinar today, and appreciate your time and attention to this category of standards, and hope you all have a great day. Thank you.